DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy, family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574 today. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane.
Hey, I'm Jim Sinicropi. Welcome to FLX Weekly here on Wednesday, May 7th, 2025. Coming at you live from the FingerLakes1.com studios in Seneca Falls, New York. Special show today. We're going to welcome Judy Hart. She's the founding superintendent of the Women's Rights National Historic Park here in Seneca Falls and author of A National Park for Women's Rights, a book about the how the Women's Rights National Park here in Seneca Falls came about. It released in October. Looking forward to talking to Judy remotely from Richmond, Virginia. But first, this episode of FLX Weekly is brought to you by West & Company Diamonds and Jewelry. West & Company Diamonds and Jewelry is a full-service family-owned jewelry store serving Auburn and the surrounding communities. Check them out online at westandcompany.com or stop in and browse their selections at 10 Genesee Street in downtown Auburn. West & Company, crafting fine jewelry since 1934. And also, Blush by CV Designs. Blush by CV Designs is a local woman-owned business in the heart of the Finger Lakes, offering women's clothing and accessories, quality home goods, and unique gifts. See what everyone is talking about by visiting their location in downtown Seneca Falls or browse all their products online at shopcvdesigns.com. And of course, Christine and her team always refresh our studio decor every season, spring, summer, fall, Christmas, and keep things looking good in here for our guests and for our viewers. So with that being said, I'd like to welcome in Judy Hart. She's the author of A National Park for Women's Rights, a book about the campaign that made it happen. And, you know, having read the book, it really was a treat as a resident, a lifelong resident of Seneca Falls, and a lot of the names in the books are people that I know. My uncle Augie Sinicropi played a big part in it as well, and so it was a real treat to read. And I really think anybody that lives in Seneca Falls should probably read this and understand the important history of how we became the first national park, historical national park. Basically what Judy called an idea park. So with that said, live from Richmond, Virginia, I'd like to welcome Judy Hart in. Judy, how you doing today?
Thank you, Paul. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I feel like I'm back home digitally in Seneca Falls. It carries a very fond place in my heart. And a special thanks to your uncle, Augie Sinicropi, who was enormously important in getting the state and village efforts off the ground and supporting the federal park. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
I can remember when this was all happening, you started the effort in 1977. The park opened in 1982. I was a youngster. I was born in 1972. So about the time that this was going on, I was in second, third, fourth grade. And I can remember in third grade, my Uncle Augie coming in to present to our class with a carousel of slides, pictures of locations in Seneca Falls, and really describing the history of Seneca Falls, especially from the women's rights movement perspective. And it was the first time that I really kind of grasped, things that had happened here in our little hometown. And for you too, Judy, it must have been, when did you first become aware of Seneca Falls and everything that happened here that compelled you to, put so much of your effort into creating this national park?
I love that question. As with everybody my age, and of course I'm quite a senior citizen at this point, I didn't learn women's history. And I spent 4 years at Cornell, 40 minutes away. I never learned a thing about Seneca Falls or women's history. And hardly anybody did in that era. And thankfully, things have changed enormously. And that's certainly part of my inspiration. I had just been appointed to a new position in Boston. I was the chief ranger for legislation.
Mm-hmm.
It's only the United States Congress can create a national park. So working in legislation is a big job in the Park Service. So I was brand new, and the Washington office called and said, what do you want to propose for a new park in your region? And I said, well, I'll get back to you. I've been here 2 days. And so I talked to a few people and my new boss, and nobody had any ideas. And I had just finished reading the index of national parks, and the table of contents had things like national parks, national historical parks, presidents' homes, recreation areas, Civil War parks. Bottom of the table of contents had an asterisk that said African American history is interpreted in all parks. Well, I'd already been there for 2 years in another department. I knew that wasn't true, but it made me mad that there was no asterisk for women's history.
Sure.
Or any indication in that front page that the Park Service was doing women's history. And they weren't much. There were 318 parks. 3 were named after women in 1978. So I called back to the Washington. I talked to my boss, and I said, I want something about women's history. And that's all I knew. And he said, well, cool, go find one. He'd worked all over the United States, and he knew that that was not a topic that anybody was talking about in the Park Service. So I called my liaison in Washington, which happily was a woman. And she was very excited. But she said, if you don't start with a place that's already nationally significant, it's dead in the water.
Mm-hmm.
She was the only professional woman in headquarters in Washington. So a week later, I went down for a week of training, and I followed her around to her incredible job. And Thursday night, we sat down to read the Federal Register of Historic Places, which the Park Service creates. There are places that aren't in parks, but are considered nationally significant. And we looked at my 6 states, and we found 2 places, the home of Susan B. Anthony and the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Honestly, I'd never heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I didn't know who she was, and neither did Peggy. We both knew Anthony. She had a very public life, but Stanton's was different. So I went back to Boston. My boss said, great, figure it out. So we started the study process, which involved several stages, but was quite thrilling. I got to work on all of them. And I started talking to people, and somebody knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew Nancy Dubner, and she knew Lucille Pavaro. So I ended up talking to Lucille Pavaro. And by then I knew who Elizabeth Cady Stanton was. So I found out that there was the Stanton House in Seneca Falls, still standing. And they said the Hunt House, where the ladies had the Tea Party and decided to hold a convention, was still standing in Waterloo.
Mm-hmm.
McClintock House, where they wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which was the agenda for the conference, was still standing, and was the Wesleyan Chapel. And that was all I knew. Still standing, I think, were the words. So we got to work, and my boss assigned another woman and me to do the early stages of the study. So we went out to Seneca Falls. It was a shock. We went to the Stanton House, and we were meted by an enormous group of people so excited about us being there and the possibilities. I didn't see much of the house because there were like 12 people around me the whole time we were there, and everybody talking at once. So then we got back and caravanned over to Fall Street and stopped and parked and got out, and I'm looking all around. I was told it was the biggest building in town, in the village. But I didn't see the Wesleyan Chapel, and somebody finally said, well, it's the laundromat that you're looking at.
Right.
Like, you must be kidding. I wanted to laugh, but I stifled it. And I thought, well, I don't care. I am now determined to have a national park in Seneca Falls, New York. I don't know what in the world we'll do with this, but only the National Park Service is going to take it on, and I have great faith in the National Park Service. So I said, okay. And the woman who went with me, I could tell there was a great big no written on her face. We fought for months after that. Fortunately, my view prevailed. Then I went over to the Hunt House, which is lovely. And then we went to the McClintock House, which at that point, the church, and they were in the process of moving out, but they were still using it. It was leaning a little bit over the McClintock House. It was about 12 inches away. And that wall of the church was stabilized with iron rods that ran through the church and big wooden planks that ran the length of the church. I'm like, okay, I don't know who but the Park Service is going to do this. Excuse me. But all of that just ignited more of a fire to do it. I thought, here are these incredibly, incredibly important resources where the Park Service can show the women's rights movement began right here. And of course, I'm sure everybody knows by now that a major focus of that convention and the outrage about it was asking for the right to vote, which of course didn't happen until 1920. But all of that just made me more determined to do something about it and get a national park in Seneca Falls.
Yeah, you mentioned off the top how there was an asterisk for Black history being recognized in national parks, but nothing for women. A couple of things I wanted to ask you about in historical context. First of all, we elected, obviously, first African-American president, Barack Obama. It's hard to believe, maybe, that it would seem that would be harder to accomplish than electing a woman president. But here we are in 2025, and still there has never been a female president of the United States. So that's kind of striking to me. But how did you feel when first Hillary Clinton, but then the president of the United States, Barack Obama, actually mentioned Seneca Falls, to a national audience? I mean, that had to be almost surreal, and that's something that probably wouldn't have happened without, your efforts.
I was thrilled beyond words, and thank you for reminding me of what a thrilling moment that was. That is the essence of the National Park Service. That's the whole point of the National Park Service. Congress passed a law in 1935 that added the mission of the history of our country to the big Western national parks that people think about, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, specifically handed to the Park Service the direction to study the country, the history of the country, and to take the nationally significant stories and highlight them in a national park. And the phrase that I really learned for the first time when I went to work for the Park Service, and I love to this day, in perpetuity. That takes on a new meaning right this moment,
Right.
but the idea is that the parks will be there forever because they are the most important stories in our history. And the whole point of creating one is that, the president will know it's there, although he received a lot of information about it. But so the president will know it's there, and so that everybody in the country and internationally will know it's there.
Yeah, and it belongs to the American citizens as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's all taxpayer money that supports the Park Service.
I can remember, as a youngster, when first hearing that we were potentially going to become a national park, and a lot of people thought, they pictured Yellowstone and some of the, the Grand Canyon, and it just didn't really make sense how it was going to work out. But how it came to fruition is pretty outstanding. And since that time till now, millions have visited Seneca Falls to see the places where these things happened, and it's just a phenomenal thing to me to think about. Seneca Falls, big industrial town, in the 30s, 40s, since the beginning of time until about the past 20, 30 years, where the kind of the manufacturing is left. And, I don't know what would have become of us if we hadn't had this designation as a national park and embraced our history. So much of our calendars built around it. And it's always phenomenal to me to see the people walking around downtown Seneca Falls who I know are here, as tourists, and then also to travel to different parts of the country and have people recognize, when I tell them where I'm from, the significance of it. When you were working to get this park established, could you let me change the question. Looking at where we're at now, and you were just here in October in Seneca Falls again, which must have been great coming back. How do you feel about where we are now? And how does that fit your vision of what you may have had in 1982 when the park launched with you as the founding superintendent?
Well, a couple of things I want to point out about that. I wrote the book. I decided to write the book, and people have been telling, let me back up. It was very complicated getting the park off the ground through the Park Service, through Congress, and getting the support in the community. None of that was simple. Mm-hmm. And the people that helped work on that, including Judy Sinicropi, of course, were absolutely critical to that. And that's what the book outlines, is what it took to create that national park. Nothing straightforward about it. It was very quick because the supporters in the end outweighed the detractors and made it happen, with a nod to Senator Dana Patrick Moynihan, who was a big push behind it. What I heard all the way through that early process, the Park Service has a intense study process, and that ends up going to Congress, and it triggers their work on a potential new park. I invited everybody that I talked to come and visit Seneca Falls. Augie told me once that they used to say, "Oh, the silk tie guys are coming to town." And they all would say the same thing. I'd give them the tour and they'd say, "It doesn't look like a national park." Well, the laundromat didn't look like a national park, but that was my job when I got out there, was to get those buildings acquired and restored so that it looked like a national park. And the politics of the time they got quite complicated. Jimmy Carter signed the legislation, his last act, I was told. And then Ronald Reagan came in, and one of the early announcements was, we need to get rid of some national parks. They're not all important. We can't afford them. Yeah. And that gave me a lot of energy and momentum in the time I was out there. But I did come back to Seneca Falls for the Women's March in 2017. Okay. And I knew I couldn't go to Washington. I knew there were going to be several million too many people for me. And I thought, well, it'll be kind of cozy and nice to be back in Seneca Falls. 10,000 people came.
Yeah, it was phenomenal.
And I thought, this park has just taken on another new relevance, and people deserve to know what it took to make this park, and that it can be done in spite of a lot of people saying, "Oh, that's impossible. You can't do that. Doesn't look like a national park. You can't do that." Well, you can. If you're determined enough and you pull together enough other people who are determined, you can make it happen.
I can remember when this was happening. Again, I was very young, but I can remember a lot of people in the community thought it was a joke or thought it was a dumb idea, which is hard to believe. But, for me, I've always had a lot of pride in my hometown and the things that have happened here, not only from the perspective of women's rights, but, Gould's Pumps made pumps that, changed the world globally. It seems like Seneca Falls, to me, for such a small upstate community, had facilitated so much change throughout the entire world. It's definitely something, that I'm still very proud of. I guess I didn't want to, run through the book because people can buy the book and read the book, and they should, especially if they have an affinity for Seneca Falls or any interest in, the history of women's rights. It's phenomenal. I guess one thing that I've kind of felt in recent years is that I think when you look at the timeline of American history, people think, well, okay, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Act, that solved racism, and and the women earned the right to vote in the 1920s, and so that solved women's inequality, and now we just move on in life. One frustration that I have, I guess, with the way that maybe things are in Seneca Falls right now is that I still want Seneca Falls to be a beacon, a conduit of change for women globally. I have a daughter who's in college now. It's still harder for her. She still will not have the same ability to earn as a man, I suppose, throughout her career. And there's obviously across the world, there's still plenty of places where women are face, complete oppression, and don't have rights, the basic human rights. What do you view the role of the national park now in that whole, the state of the world, I suppose?
Well, two things come to mind. One thing that you and Seneca Falls can be very proud of, as you mentioned earlier, it became known as the first idea park.
Mm-hmm.
What that meant was the Park Service was forced by me and other people to look at the fact that the structures didn't look like a national park. Even though we have many, many experts in doing the restoration, and they did a fabulous job with the buildings, but it had to face the fact that while it's considered its mission is to tell the story, interpret the story through historic structures, and that distinguishes it from museums or anything else that we tell the story through the historic buildings. But there is a difference between the buildings and the story.
Right.
And that was finally accepted by the Park Service, or at least enough of them. Always the directors. I give credit to the directors. Everybody who made this park happen, included in Washington, Peggy Lipson, my liaison, everybody else was a man. And the key ones did support it. That distinction had to be absorbed. And what that did, among other things, was throw open the door for other sites that didn't look like a national park. And the most obvious one is Stonewall Tavern.
Mm-hmm.
It's still a tavern. You can still go there and buy a beer. Park Service basically has a sign across the street. The Underground Railroad, the Manzanar Japanese internment sites during World War II, any number of parks now exist because of women's rights. And this idea that this concept that the story is nationally significant. The buildings will figure out what to do. We'll figure out how to make a park. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I can't turn it off because I'm using the hotspot. Sorry.
No, it's fine. So talk a little bit now about the current, I guess, state of political culture in America. Obviously, a lot of cuts at the federal level, but specifically cuts to funding for national parks from the Trump administration. And again, to me, it highlights the fact that the fight's never over when you're talking about women's rights or civil rights. How do you feel about the current state of things in this country?
Concerned, worried, anxious, and hopeful. I have a Master of Arts in law, and I've always been fascinated by the law and legal issues and how our system works. And I have great faith, even though it seems a bit rocky, but I have great faith that our legal system is going to uphold the fundamentals of our law. I'm in the minority, I think, among the people I talk to, but I do have great faith in that. One answer to that is visitors would often ask me, where does this come from? And one of the things that was driving me, I wanted women to understand on a personal level, if you're finding difficulties in your career, your relationships, your marriage, it's not just personal. There's a whole context of discrimination against women that's broad and deep. It's not all your fault. That was really important to me. And often women visitors would come to me. I always had an open door. And they'd say, well, where does this come from? And having studied law, I would always say, well, our legal system is based on English common law. And under English common law, women were equated with idiots and children.
Mm-hmm.
And they would be pleased with this new information, this new insight. But I'd be sitting there thinking, well, okay, that gets them back to 1880, but then what? And I actually learned quite a lot about England in 1880 and do understand more information than I could cover in this interview. But even that doesn't answer the question. The simple version of that is it was a caste issue in 1880, but that's all I'm going to say. And I had people say, well, it started with the Bible. And when I retired, even before I retired, every time I met a lawyer or a philosopher or somebody who I thought was a deep thinker, I'd say, where does this come from? And I finally met what I thought was the perfect person to answer this question. Beautiful, spiritual woman who was in California. And she said, that is such a complicated question. She gave me a few books to read, but I don't know the answer to that. And it's not simple. To me, it seems more complicated. No, I don't want to sound odd about this, but to me, it seems a little more complicated than racial discrimination,
Right.
which is, well, they're both created, society has created all of the prejudice, in my opinion. But I don't know where it came from.
Well, you mentioned is compared to racial discrimination. The difference is, in my mind, that women are part of the families of the oppressors. Like legitimately, they're beloved in some cases. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
So to me, it doesn't make sense. And still, here we are, in 2025, and women's rights are under attack more than they've been in the past 30 years here in 2025.
Well, one thing I would add, and I think, people would often ask me, why Seneca Falls? And I said, well, you maybe don't see it now, but Seneca Falls was on the thoroughfare of the West. So everybody who was discontent and wanted a bigger life was traveling through Seneca Falls and that area, which came to be known, as you know, the burned over district. There were so many social revolutions going on in the region. But I also think it's very important that Seneca Falls changed from a very small community surrounded by agriculture. And when the dam was built, all the industries came to Seneca Falls.
Right.
And it changed the economy of the community, but it changed the economy in the marriage, in my opinion. Because on a farm, the husband and wife, and there weren't many other choices at that time, had equally critical roles. They were different, but they were absolutely essential. Once industry came to Seneca Falls, there was, among some families, a shift. All of a sudden, the husband was making money, the wife was spending it. And a very different power dynamic came in. And I think, I'm fascinated that 300 people would have showed up at that convention in 1848. Women were not supposed to leave the house without their husband. They weren't supposed to speak in public. They certainly weren't supposed to speak to men, and they did all of those. And they asked for the right to vote, of all things.
And they traveled, it's quite distance, and it wasn't like you hopped on a train or hopped on a bus back then or a plane. Traveling distances was difficult. And And Frederick Douglass, for example, made the trip. But but the women that went, is even locally, maybe especially locally, really were under scrutiny. I guess it wasn't an easy thing for them to just
Absolutely.
attend.
And I have wondered about that for years. Did they lie to their husband? Did they steal the horse? Did they borrow somebody else's wagon? Did they actually walk an incredible distance in those flimsy little shoes they wore then? How did they get there? Because 300 people is a lot in Seneca Falls. But I do think part of that, clearly there was unrest that already existed that drove them to go to the convention. And thank God for that, because it set off a series of conventions very quickly, started happening all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
That new dynamic was so outrageous to society that the folks like you back in the day were reporting this outrageous new thing is happening in Seneca Falls.
Right.
What are these people doing? But that publicized it and made it a national issue, a national event.
Yeah, even the coverage that was sometimes negative towards, like, this shouldn't be happening. These women should know their place. And really outrageous and political cartoons, the whole gamut. But as you mentioned, it gave exposure to other women throughout the country who, even though they were reading what would be considered maybe negative press about it, they were probably realized how silly that was, and that might have even galvanized them further to do things locally in their communities to further the movement.
It absolutely did. There were conventions sprang up all over. The first national one was shortly after that in Worcester, Massachusetts. It lit a fire that was ready to be lit. That was true.
Well, geez, I really enjoyed this conversation. I wish we could spend some more time. But if you've enjoyed this conversation, the best next step for you to take would probably be to pick up this book, A National Park for Women's Rights, by Judy Hart. Where can people get it, Judy?
It's for sale in the Visitor Center, and it's for sale on the Cornell University website, who published it, of course, and it's available on Amazon.
Yep. It's an easy read. It's a fascinating read if you are from Seneca Falls, for sure. I mean, I don't know how you could live in Seneca Falls and not want to read this book. But also for folks, around the country that are trying to kind of make sense of the political climate now. And, it's a bit inspiring, because to achieve the national park here in Seneca Falls, it required a lot of faith, a lot of hope, and a lot of cooperation. So it's great that it's actually documented now, because before it was just stories. I talked to my Uncle Og about it and learn a little bit, but to have it now, documented in this book is really fantastic. So I appreciate, first of all, as a citizen of Seneca Falls and being born and lived here my whole life, I want to thank you for your efforts in bringing the park here, but then also for writing this great book. And it's been a pleasure talking to you today, Judy.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for promoting my book. And I would add, it warms my heart when somebody says, oh, I've got to get one for each of my grandchildren.
Yeah, especially the next generation. Even today, I don't think that we do a good enough job in our local school system. And this isn't a knock on any of our teachers or our school system, which is great, but I just think we could do a better job of informing our students at a young age of the significance of things that have happened here, because it's phenomenal.
I want to say again, thank you for this program. I love Seneca Falls. I love the park, of course. I love the stories. Happy to come back anytime you have time for round two.
Well, we might have to do that, because there is a lot I'd still like to talk about. And also, if you ever make it back up to Seneca Falls again, hopefully, please look us up here at fingerlakes1.com and look me up. Even if we could just have lunch, it would be great, or have you in studio here in person. But appreciate your time, Judy. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. See you soon, I hope.
I hope so too. So thanks everybody for joining us today. If you did enjoy the show, click like, share, and subscribe. We'll be back again next week. We'll have Ariel Staffen. She's currently serving as Miss Finger Lakes 2025. Until then, have a great weekend. Hopefully the rain's going to stop. It's pretty relentless. Keep the faith. Summer's coming. Hopefully it begins this weekend. So have a good one, everybody.
I have one question, if I may.
FingerLakes1.com